For more than 2 decades, Iranians have taken to the streets to protest their government. The demonstrations right now are large, but not the largest that Iran has ever seen. The government has responded the way it does: crackdowns, arrests, internet shutdowns. And yet, even as the space to organize shrinks, the protests keep coming back. This week, the death toll reportedly passed 2,000. Outside voices are also growing louder. In the United States, President Trump has posted that help is on the way. What that actually will mean in a country with a long history of foreign intervention is far from clear. To help make sense of it, we are joined by journalist and New York University professor Azadeh Moaveni and Chatham House scholar and expert Dr. Sanam Vakil. Both have spent years following these events up close and know what it looks like when a movement begins to shift. So, are we watching another familiar cycle, or the early signs of a real change in Iran? And what does power inside the country actually look like right now? I'm Leslie Vinjamori, President and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and welcome to Deep Dish. Let me start out. Maybe we can come to you first, Sanam. I just read your piece yesterday in The Guardian. You mentioned, we've seen cycles of protests since 2009. Maybe you could set the stage for our listeners and for me on the context in which Iran finds itself in these current protests. Are they linked, and how significant is this moment?
These protests are a result of a number of converging crises. They're also a result of the Islamic Republic's unwillingness to respond to these crises, or choosing to delay or detract or distract from these crises rather than address what are profound economic grievances, profound governance challenges that have become politicized and very clearly striking at the heart of the Islamic Republic's legitimacy. And they intertwine right now in this moment, regionally and internationally, with Israel's wars in the region, Israel-Iran tensions. And, it's worthwhile reminding your listeners that just last summer, Iran and Israel engaged in a direct war where the United States also entered and hit at Iran's nuclear facilities. So, effectively, this is the intersection of economic issues, deep political ones, and regional and international ones. But these protests go back in time. They do go back from before 2009, actually. There were really powerful protests in 1999 in Iran, student-led. And with each protest that we've seen become really endemic and part of Iranian political life, protests have become more powerful. They become much more political. And with each protest, the government has not responded to protester demands.
Azadeh, let me come to you. Do you see this moment as different? And maybe you could also set the scene for us. Perhaps give us a sense, and I know it's very hard to know exactly what's going on inside of Iran right now, but if anybody knows, it would be the two of you. Do you have a sense of scale, of numbers of people protesting? I know there's been a lot of different numbers, and one hates to even try to talk about the number of people who have been murdered on the streets by the regime. But can you give us a sense of the scale, and then, how do you see these protests in the sort of context of these protests?
So these protests in size, in volume, any single protest, if you were to look at images of them as some sort of indication, are not as vast as previous moments of protest have been. The 2009 protests that Sanam mentioned brought 1 million Iranians into the street, and you could just see a sea of humanity, down the central boulevards of Tehran. We don't have images like that because people have not gone out in those numbers. As far as we can tell, we're constrained, of course, by the total internet and communications blackout that the regime has imposed. That said, their breadth is extraordinary. Our sense of things, as we're piecing together information from the last several days, is that they are very, very broader than other previous moments of national protest. It's noteworthy where they've started and just how granular they've been geographically. Small towns, provinces, border areas, shanty towns, banlieues, places that people have never even heard of in the city. And they have been propelled initially by the working poor. To sort of pick up on what Sanam said about the convergence of crises, I think what makes this moment different, and I do think it is a profound challenge to the system, perhaps more profound than it's seen in the past because they're more violent. The sort of nature of the clashes between protesters, called rioters by the system, and security forces has been very fierce. Estimates now seems to be between 2,500 and perhaps up to 10,000, 12,000 protesters killed, which is just an extraordinary number. The Islamic Republic has never had a violent confrontation so lethal with its people since its inception. And then the last thing I'll say, how bad it is and how we got here. The economic crisis that Sanam mentioned in the last year has just grown particularly acute. The decline in the Iranian currency, which is long running, had a sort of massive intensification, losing its value over and over again, essentially, on top of 6 years of running inflation. So, in the last year, most working families in Iran have not been able to feed themselves. The average salary of a worker, even working 2 jobs, does not cover the food basket of a family of 3 or 4. So people have been starving. And that's part of the desperation and the fury that we see.
Sanam, let me come to you on this. The title of your article yesterday, "With thousands dead, the Iranian regime may survive these protests, but not in its current form." I mean, you clearly also see these protests as different, more consequential for the current regime. Can you tell us more? How is it different? How strong is the regime? I mean, you sort of say it might survive, but not in its current form. What does that mean?
Let's just take a step back and think about the political or social contract that came into formation after the 1979 revolution. This was a popular-led revolution. It led to an Islamic government. The principle of this system of governance was social justice. The economic livelihood of ordinary citizens was meant to get better. And then there is, of course, a religious dimension to this system of governance where, they consider themselves as a system sort of divined or ordained by God, through Islam or their interpretation of Shia Islam. And over these 4+ decades inside Iran, the economic environment, by their own mismanagement, by endemic corruption, has become really challenging for ordinary people. The cost of living crisis is really severe. Poverty levels have doubled inside Iran. The middle class is not the middle class anymore. They are lower middle class or less at this point. So that economic failure is really pervasive. On top of that, the political governance contract has fallen apart. This is a system that has constrained civil rights, liberties, dignity of ordinary people. And these demands have been expressed repeatedly in protests going back over the decades. And so there's a convergence of failures on this system. There was a constituency of politicians in Iran that emerged that are known as reformists, that were advocating for reform of this system. But nothing has really reformed within the Islamic Republic. And so where do we stand today? The Islamic Republic has at the helm a leader who is 86 years old. He's been in power since 1989. He's certainly guided this system against reform. Standing up to the West is his big principle. And the social contract has broken under his leadership. The political contract has broken under his leadership. And the way they can, I think, survive is really at this point only through brute force. They have shown over the past 2+ weeks that they're willing to do anything to stay in power. There are no red lines or limits. Killing, through lethal force an inordinate number of citizens is atrocious. And so I think that, they're relying on a narrow base and violence, suppression, surveillance, which to me, conjures up memories of Saddam Hussein's Iraq after the first Gulf War, is the direction of travel. It's not a certainty that it ends that way. There are 1,000 scenarios where this could all splinter into, but right now as it stands, as the protests narrow, as repression is heavy, as people are exhausted and frustrated and constrained, there's no legitimacy left. And so violence and repression is what's left.
So Azadeh and Sanam, the thing that we continue to hear from people who are expert on Iran is that when you do actually see a change, is that you get divisions within the regime. Are we seeing this in Iran? Is there any evidence that there is a fracture, that there's, something that's going to change this? Or if not, what would actually lead to a change?
No, if anything, I think in the last 3 or 4 days, we have seen the regime come together. The president, the country's top security official are all taking the same line, that many of the protesters are actually rioters, that the schema of this unrest is a plot engineered by Iran's regional enemies, Israel, and its great enemy, the United States. Everyone is reading from the same script right now because it seems like such a moment of particular panic for the entire system. So at this point, there's no indication of fracture at all, although we know that the regime is not a monolith, that in the security establishment, that in the Revolutionary Guards, there are elements that are more reactionary, that seek war, that seek regional confrontation, and there are ones that believe that in order to ensure the survival of the regime, Iran needs to change course in some way. And so we know that exists in the backdrop, those strands of approach and perspective, but we're not seeing that come to the fore right now. But I think that external events will potentially hasten or shift that. But I think this is a system that has reached the end of its line. Whatever is the trigger for the transformation, is it a slow burn of protests like Sanam described? The economy is on the verge of collapse. So even if the regime, doesn't change politically at the top, it really can't sustain itself any further. And without structural change, it will not be able to bring any income into the country, and we'll just see repeated bouts of protests. So, the system is at a dead end, but there's no indication that there's a significant splinter at present to shift course.
So, Sanam, the system is at a dead end, on the verge of economic collapse. We've seen the United States impose a 25% tariff on anybody who trades with Iran, which presumably is making the situation even worse. I assume that's being passed down, the cost of that, to the people. So, first of all, is there an opposition waiting to take over?
Well, no, there is no one opposition waiting to take over. And that is a blessing and a curse, to be quite frank. The Iranian opposition, I believe, exists inside Iran. And that isn't just going to be composed of people who are protesting on the streets. There have been people who have been members of the political opposition, either from within the system or as activists that have emerged over the past 4 decades. And there is a very active civil society that has been constrained and under surveillance. And there are activists, unfortunately, too many activists in Iranian prisons that were even rounded up just a few weeks ago, including Nobel laureate Narges Mohammadi, including many excellent lawyers and political activists and student activists. There is also the traditional activist communities inside Iran, the labor movement, the student movement. We know this because they protested over the past 2 days. Despite the government's effort at constraining such activism, they still mobilize. But there is not one person, there is not one leader. And that's because of the dynamics inside the country.
There are conversations about members of the diaspora, the Shah's son, and this happens in other countries. We see leading members of the diaspora come back when there's a moment of transition, sometimes very successfully. What is your particular view on that? Could that be a solution?
The diaspora has been building. It's about 5 million people, let's say, that are, of course, animated by their trauma of not being in Iran and animated by their nationalist impulse towards Iran, but very divided. And they've not coalesced around a single figure. You have monarchists, you have nationalists, you have all sorts of views, but there is not one unified coalition-based organization. One did try to emerge during the 2022 protests, but it fragmented because of the personalities. And here, this is where it's very easy and lazy to think that the name of Reza Pahlavi, who has emerged in the diaspora in particular as a candidate for a transitional figure as he puts himself forward, could be an option, an alternative for Iran. And here I would caution people. Reza Pahlavi has built a bit more of an organized coalition abroad. And he's gained some support, perhaps from the Israelis and monarchists in the diaspora. But he doesn't really have a political CV, if you will. He hasn't really, I think, developed a program or policy or built a network that is inclusive for Iranians. But he has name recognition that is associated with life before the revolution, a lot of nostalgia. And I think that people mobilized using his name over the past 2 weeks as a counter to the Islamic Republic. And it's easy to think that that means, okay, he's the guy, but it's not really necessary that he's the guy. I think Iranian people should be given a chance to choose what comes next, who comes next, and what the next system of governance should be.
So this takes us right to the conversation that's sort of all over the news. I'm sure you're deeply engaged in it about, what, if anything, can and should the United States do?
I think we can see that there's a range of opinion about what the United States should do. I mean, I think that there's fierce opposition to any kind of foreign intervention. Iran's celebrated filmmakers, directors, the Nobel laureate that Sanam mentioned, the sort of civil society opposition inside the country are very clear and adamant that they don't believe that foreign intervention by the United States is healthy for Iran. The argument there is that it actually gives the system a pretext to crack down on protesters because it can label them as agents of the United States, as foreigners, as not Iranian, and that's language that we've heard. And it's interesting, that was also language that was used in 1978 during the revolution. Iranians don't kill Iranians. The people who are calling for the end of the regime must be outsiders. So I think whatever the range of options are, and we'll talk about that, there's a very real fear that any kind of intervention, whether it's kinetic and military or increased economic pressure, will worsen the situation for protesters on the ground and also just tar the whole movement with the perception that it's been propelled from the outside. And Iranians have long ceded sort of ancient hostility to the idea of having their internal affairs meddled with, having their leaders put in place or removed. You do see people very angry online from inside Iran, outside in the diaspora, angry and asking for intervention. So, I mean, that element of opinion is there. I wouldn't say it's the majority view. But maybe Sanam can talk us through the options and perhaps which are the least worst.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because to listen to you, and it makes eminent sense, right? That there's a backlash against an imperialist power intervening. But at the same time, if the numbers are even anywhere close to accurate or perhaps worse, you can't help from the outside but think that there must be some lever that could be pulled to try and influence in a positive direction the outcome. But Sanam, talk us through the options.
I mean, there are three broad options, right? The first is surgically strike security and military locations inside the country, but not to debilitate the regime. And that line would be symbolic, if you will. It would certainly try to empower the protesters by maybe constraining the regime's ability to further repress the society, but it wouldn't really bring down the Islamic Republic. It's sort of a neither here nor there option, which with it comes a variety of risks. The hardening of the regime, regional conflict, because the Islamic Republic has said very forcefully and openly for a number of days now, they will respond. And they will hit Israel, they might hit U.S. bases in the region, already announcements of a drawdown of non-essential personnel at Al Udeid base in Qatar. So that's one scenario. Scenario two is the repeat of 2003 and the Iraq War, a regime change in the Islamic Republic of Iran to properly alter the balance of power and invest in a bigger project, which of course doesn't sound very MAGA, or even achievable because that project was very costly, wasn't well executed. Americans and Donald Trump have voted against those kind of policies. And, the landscape of Iran is certainly, not going to necessarily be easy to manage. The third option on the table, where President Trump has repeatedly said since coming back in his second term that he's happy to make a deal. He wants to make Iran great again. This is a commercially motivated president. Iran is the last frontier market in the Middle East. There's a lot of money to be made in Iran. And so whether it's through a Venezuela-like scenario of, copy, paste, remove, and revive the Islamic Republic, or they will succumb to Trump's maximum pressure. And that can be packaged as, hey, maximum pressure worked, and the American system got what they wanted. What worries me is that the Pottery Barn, you broke it, you fix it, policy isn't going to apply to Iran. The United States can break a few of the pieces, try to weaken Iran, but won't be there to support the transition, to help the people. And what we will see still is a ferocious but resilient Islamic Republic.
Sanam, let me ask you on that third option, because it's absolutely key. And, diplomacy isn't just diplomacy. It's coercive diplomacy, usually, where you're pushing for a certain outcome, but there's got to be a carrot and a stick. Usually the stick is the threat to use some sort of military force or, more sanctions or something. But what would that look like?
I would say that the terms and conditions that are currently on the table, what the Trump administration wants from Iran is a commitment on its nuclear program, not to revive it, to leave it buried underground. That's one. Two, now in this weakened state, the issue of Iran's ballistic missile program is going to become very relevant, and there will need to be constraints in that realm so as not to threaten Israel, not to threaten the Gulf states, but ultimately the United States. And thirdly, of course, commitments that Iran will not rearm or refund its so-called axis of resistance, the non-state actors in Arab countries. So that's principally what's on the table. It's maximum surrender, as it's seen by Tehran, and thus far they have rejected those terms. Ali Khamenei, in my opinion, has been buying time, and they've been negotiating for quite some time and have never come to a deal. So that tells us a lot about their intent. Everybody would like a deal in the Middle East. Nobody would like to see another round of conflict. All foreign ministers are working their phones, trying to bring down the temperature right now. But I'm not confident that they will prevail.
Azadeh, your thoughts on this?
It's worth quickly just thinking back to where we were in the summer. Iran found itself, despite its very costly nuclear program, which it's pursued for decades now, sustaining sanctions in an impoverished economy on the basis that it would provide the country security and deterrence and protect it from outside attack, that it would, in the region that we've seen so destabilized since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, that Iran would not become Iraq, it would not become Syria, it would not become Libya, because we have this nuclear program. And the summer, and even events before that, gave the lie to that deterrence or security doctrine. Iran was attacked by Israel. It had its nuclear facilities bombed by the United States. Before that, it was severely penetrated by Israeli intelligence, such that a foreign guest, one of the leaders of Hamas, was assassinated in Tehran in broad daylight. Iranians experienced 12 days of war. And at the end of this, the Islamic Republic chose not to change course, essentially. Iranians did not rise up. They sort of nationalistically stayed in their homes and withstood a 12-day assault. And you would think that, having benefited from the loyalty of its population, that the strategic thinking in the regime at such a precipice would have adjusted course in some way. Perhaps not the kind of multi-tiered total compression that Sam just described, that the United States is demanding from it on all fronts. But perhaps, at least in a small measure, a small directional change domestically, so that the economy, which is bleeding, could be stemmed. So I guess an example of this is after the summer and the war with Israel, when the economy and the rial was tanking, the government decided to import high-octane fuel used only by luxury cars. This is where its priorities were. I mean, the degree to which the state in its present form is able to make decisions, or is willing to make decisions in the national interests of Iranians, and interests that are decisions in the interests of Iran's territorial sovereignty and security, I believe we see as compromised. It seems to be a state that's incapable for its own survival, let alone the interests of its own population, choose amongst the steps that could de-escalate or that could even sustain it economically, which is why I think we're in such strange and unprecedented times. I mean, the system is completely paralyzed. And while diplomacy is a dragon and it's an option. When they do go to the table, they're not ready to make any kind of compromise. They play for time and they just sit in the same cul-de-sac. Perhaps after seeing the ferocity of people's anger, there will be some altered thinking inside the system in the days ahead. But it's at present sort of hard to see them making choices now any different from the catastrophic choices they've made in the last 4 months, 6 months, 12 months, 10 years.
An extraordinarily difficult situation to talk about, one that's deeply personal for the diaspora, highly consequential for Iranians, for Iran, for the region, for the world. As we close, Sanam, what is your realistic hope for best case?
My hope is, of course, that people in Iran are safe and protesters prevail, because this has been a long struggle, a long road, and that they deserve better. They deserve dignity and everything that comes with it. But I'm a realist, unfortunately. And what I fear is that this ferocious regime will continue to strangle good people that work hard, and that nobody is really going to come and help them or save them. And hopefully, with time, they will be able to save themselves.
I'm broadly aligned with my pessimistic, optimistic sense that Sanam has. I think Iran, despite being in a terrible bind and people being in such an aggrieved state and the system in paralysis, I think it does ultimately and always has had a lot of potential. It has a very educated, worldly population. It has tremendous human resources. It has state structures. I mean, historically, even post-revolution, Iran has been a strong state. So there's a position of strength 10 years, 15 years, 20 years prior that it can go back to. And I think that's the only hopeful thing to think about right now is Iran's human resources, its potential. It's suffered terrible mismanagement. It suffers drought. People are losing electricity. It is just being predated upon by a state that has no solution. But its potential is profound, and its people deserve much, much more.
That was Azadeh Moaveni and Dr. Sanam Vakil. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Leslie Vinjamori. Talk to you next week. Deep Dish is a production of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow Deep Dish on Global Affairs wherever you get your podcasts. And if someone you know might find it interesting, send it their way. As a reminder, the opinions you heard belong to the people who expressed them and not to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. This episode is produced by Tria Raimundo and Jessica Brzeski, with support from Marty O'Connell and Lizzie Sokolich. Thank you for listening.